Afghanistan has been in the news recently due to a terrible earthquake, and it is fair to say that it is a country that is struggling economically. It is ranked 164th in the entire world. But did you know that it is actually sat on a potentially $9 trillion windfall? Yep, you heard that right, $9 trillion. In this video, I'm going to explain to you what exactly that 9 trillion comprises of and why Afghanistan was labeled by the US Department of Defense as the Saudi Arabia of lithium. But I'll also explain why the Taliban cannot access this incredible wealth right now, but how it could take steps to change that. Afghanistan is rich in an incredible and dizzying array of resources, things like copper, gold, oil, natural gas, uranium, bauxite, coal, iron ore, rare earth, lithium, chromium, lead, zinc, gemstones, talc, sulfur, travertine, gypsum, and marble, and probably even more than that. It has natural resources literally scattered all over the country, as you can see in this diagram. But the biggest and most valuable of all of these natural resources is in fact lithium, that was valued by the US Department of Defense back in 2010 at those prices at $1 trillion. And you know what? The price since then has gone up by over 7 times. And Afghanistan has 2 trillion of other natural resources as well. So in total, its combined worth of all of the natural resources that Afghanistan is sat on is close or possibly even more than $9 trillion. And this wealth won't just make Afghanistan very rich, it will also make it very influential and strategic on the geopolitical landscape. Because we've all seen how the stunning discoveries of oil and gas have propelled countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE to international prominence and a diversified economy and a seat at the geopolitical table where big decisions are being made. Why is that? Well, because oil is an essential part of our everyday life. Oil is used in all of our cars and industries. It's used in our candles, plastics, makeup, and so much more. Oil gives us petrol, which keeps our entire logistics and transport industry moving every single day. That's why when Saudi Arabia called for an oil embargo in 1973, arising out of the Arab-Israeli war taking place at that time, they gained a tremendous amount of leverage in their negotiations with the countries that they had embargoed. Now, in this century, oil, of course, is a bit of a dirty word as we are dealing with climate change. And this is where lithium comes in, because you see, lithium is the metal that is so important for the manufacture of batteries. And batteries, of course, are at the heart of this electric wave that we are going on, which we see as a more climate-friendly way of conducting our everyday lives. To give you a sense of this scale, there are literally hundreds of gigafactories that are already built or being built across the world right now, scattered all over the different continents. And these are the factories that are going to be guzzling in all of this lithium to produce the batteries that we need to replace all of our petrol-driven vehicles and machinery and heavy industry. But there's more to batteries than just replacing the cars on the road. Because you see, when we are moving in our energy production from fossil fuels to renewable sources, we're moving from coal and oil and gas, things we can switch on and off, to things like thermal energy, wind energy, solar energy, tidal energy. These are things that we don't really control as human beings. And so what that means is that we need an ability to be able to harness that energy at the time that it comes and then be able to store it ready for when it is needed by human beings in their everyday lives. And that is where batteries come in. In the UK alone, there are already half a dozen battery storage projects that are being built or already built, and the vast majority of these are based on lithium batteries. So you can see very quickly why lithium is becoming so incredibly valuable and why a country with enormous reserves of lithium will become so strategic on the global landscape. The first problem is that Taliban and Afghanistan as a whole doesn't necessarily have the skill set to be able to mine these natural resources. Because you see, mining natural resources is not like learning to drive a car. These are specialist areas with different mining techniques for each of the different natural resources, sometimes multiple techniques within each natural resource. And you need professionals, you need heavy machinery, you need the people who know how to use the machinery, and you need to know how to then access the international markets and be able to sell that produce as well. all of these skill sets that Taliban and Afghanistan unfortunately don't have an enormous amount of right now. The second problem that Afghanistan has is that it is a pariah state. It has only been recognized to date by Pakistan, China, and North Korea. Not exactly a long list and not exactly a particularly appealing list in some ways. And so it's very difficult for the Taliban to then reach out to other countries and other large corporates across the world who do have that skill set, who could partner with it to actually develop these mines, because it is seen as a persona non grata at this moment in time. The third and big problem is that the Taliban in Afghanistan doesn't have the infrastructure that is needed to mine these resources at scale, because you can't just mine the resources, you then need to have the roads and the roads of sufficient capacity to then be able to get those resources out. You need to have processing facilities to get those natural resources ready for export. You need to have the safety and security to ensure that all of the workers and all of the companies that are at the heart of this project are not fearful of their lives and actually continue doing what they're doing. You need to have that international infrastructure so that you are able to sell your goods and services simply and easily using existing financial services. And again, unfortunately, this is not where Afghanistan is right now. Look, the situation in Afghanistan is a tough one, it's a difficult one, and none of the actors on the pitch are necessarily just angels. Everyone's got something on them. But there are some ways, in my humble view, not an Afghanistan expert, but just reading the analysis, that the Taliban can take a few steps to actually resolve this and tentatively start moving towards being able to exploit the natural resources that it has. Look, the first issue is that of skill set, and I get it. I get that Taliban doesn't necessarily want to work with external people. It wants to work with its own people, trusted people. It doesn't want to work with people who were previously involved with historic governments or occupying forces. It wants that line there. However, the reality is that Taliban does not have the skill sets that it needs to be able to exploit these mines, or even the skill sets that it needs to be able to set up the Afghani government in such a way that it can attract that kind of investment to get those kind of mines built. And the kind of people that you need for this are civil servants, bureaucrats, diplomats, engineers, salespeople, high business experts. All of that is a skill set that unfortunately there's not much of in Afghanistan, and where it is found, it is often found with people who were previously involved with other governments. So the Taliban, in my humble view, should take a cautious but open view to try to work with these kind of people on the basis that it is good for the country and everyone can align on that. And also the Taliban should look to take advantage of Afghanis overseas who could potentially come back and help out their country in delivering on its promise. Look, the second issue is that of women's rights. And even those states who would be quite happy, I think, to work with Afghanistan Taliban have said that one of the big, if not the stumbling block, stopping them from doing that is the Taliban's approach to women's rights. And I get that you need to take the position of countries like the USA with a pinch of salt when the US Department of Defense in 2010 was eyeing up Afghanistan's lithium. I get that. But even countries that would otherwise be friendly, I think, with the Taliban and Afghanistan and supportive of that region and that nation, they balk at working with this government with the view that it has taken on female rights. And this is something the Taliban actually has the control over and can change so that people do start working with it. The Taliban has consistently made noises about increasing women's employment and education, but unfortunately that has not transpired. In fact, one could argue quite the opposite seems to have taken place thus far. This is not an Islamic option. This is not what Islam would ask of the Afghanis. And in a very revealing clip, when a member of the Taliban was interviewed or put under some pressure by a female activist, this is what happened.
و دیگر گفتمان شما یا نظریات شما را من تایید میکنم. واقعا هم به این راست تشویشتان بجاست. زمانی که منبر از نظام فاصله گرفت و علیش قرار گرفت.
As you can see, there is a schism within the Taliban itself. You have some more progressive factions that are quite happy to have women's education and employment, whereas you've got others who are a lot more traditional, I think, culturally rooted, who say that women should not be allowed to do this. And because the Taliban wants to keep both of these sides together, it decides to go for the most cautious of these approaches and not give women the rights that they should have. And look, again, I get it. The Afghanis have a different culture, and different societies have different cultures with respect to how a man is supposed to behave, how a woman is supposed to behave, how the interaction is. And the Afghani culture is particularly conservative. And I get that they don't necessarily want Westerners, like, even people like me, having opinions and commenting on their way of life, their cultural way of life. But what I would sincerely and humbly say to people who are listening to this is that this is not the way of the Prophet who was married to a trader. This is not the way of the Prophet whose wives went into battle and were out and about in society. This is not the way of Islam. And if this more permissive approach was good enough for our Prophet, then it is good enough for me, and it is good enough for, I would humbly say, the Taliban in Afghanistan as well. The third key thing the Taliban needs is friends. It already has countries like Pakistan, China, some of the neighbors it has already got some informal ties with. Countries like Qatar, historically, it's had connections with. It should use these countries to slowly make itself a lot more palatable on the international scene. But all of that only happens once Afghanistan changes and the Taliban changes its posture with respect to having a broader group that it works with and its approach to women's rights. I don't want this video to be taken the wrong way. I and many of us are personally very supportive of Afghanistan and the Afghani nation. It's been through a lot, and we would love for the Afghanistani government and Taliban to not repeat the mistakes of the past, and that will result in a bad situation for everyone in Afghanistan. And actually, there are some really strong positives here, right? So the Taliban has ended pretty much the heroin trade in Afghanistan, which is fantastic, and it is a testament to them putting principles before profits, because otherwise they would have profited immensely from this trade. It's also fantastic that Taliban has created, for the first time in many, many decades, an Afghanistan that is at peace, and there isn't that much violence, and there is prosperity that has the potential to take root. It's also great that Taliban is in charge as the entity at the heart of Afghanistan, because if you've got multiple factions still fighting with each other, there's no chance that any of this can happen. So that centralization of power has now happened. So there is potential to be able to actually deliver on some of the things that we've discussed in this video. The Taliban and Afghanistan have been dealt a tough hand, but there are a few aces within that pack. And if Afghanistan plays a good game, an Islamic game, then it has the potential to achieve its full promise. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.